En nombre de la Sociedad y de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado, y en conjunto con Paz Ciudadana, tenemos a nuestro invitado principal, Lawrence Sherman. Lawrence es profesor de la Universidad de Cambridge y director del del Yearly Center for Criminology en esa universidad. El profesor Sherman ha desarrollado investigaciones y experimentos en más de 30 países sobre agencias y tácticas policiales, y al igual en países como Estados Unidos, la Policía Federal de Alemania, policías del Reino Unido, etcétera. En el plano académico, el profesor Sherman ha trabajado en varias universidades, en particular en el último tiempo en la Universidad de Maryland en Estados Unidos y desde hace unos 5 años en Cambridge. En su reciente investigación, de la cual algo veremos hoy, la estrategia del triple T, for Evidence-Based Decision Making, trata precisamente sobre cómo usar la mayor evidencia para focalizar, poner a prueba y monitorear el uso de recursos para lograr objetivos. En su charla de hoy, el profesor Sherman comparará cómo el presidente Obama, por ejemplo, usó el triple T para ganar elecciones y cómo usar esta estrategia de triple T para reducir la delincuencia. Mostrará cómo estas 3 T's ponen la investigación en acción y la acción en foco en cualquier organización del sector público, al igual que en varias empresas. Sin más, entonces, dejamos con usted al profesor Sherman. Él expondrá y luego de su presentación habrá espacio para preguntas del público, las cuales asignaremos desde acá. Gracias.
Thank you. I apologize for starting out with the map of social networks of robbers in Sacramento, California, which we were discussing before the lecture began. But before I go away from this slide, I want you to know that this is one of the 3 T's that was kindly mentioned in the introduction. This T is about targeting, and it's one tool that you can use in policing. If you have a robbery problem, you can map the social networks of people who commit robberies. And what you find is that at the center of almost any social network, there are people who have more connections than anybody else. And if you want to push down or up the behavior of the entire social network, you start at the center. So these big circles are robbers in Sacramento who have been arrested with many different people. And there's actually an experiment going on in Sacramento where police are intervening with the robbers who recruit other robbers to work with them. And it's actually reducing robbery in the networks where they focus compared to where they don't, which is part of testing, the second T. And if you wanted to track every week, here's the list of all of the robbery leaders, which would be tracking. Now, with this example, let me tell you about President Obama. Because not one, like two, by using this kind of method. In every voting area in some of the U.S. states, not all of the U.S. states, many of the U.S. states were absolutely never, ever going to vote for Obama. And before Bill Clinton, presidential candidates used to go to every one of the 50 states in America. And in 1992, Clinton was nominated to be president And his staff said, well, you have to go to Nebraska. He said, the state of Nebraska has not voted for a member of my party in over 100 years. Why should I go to Nebraska? And the staff was astonished. How can you not go to Nebraska? Everybody goes to Nebraska. He said, that's a waste of time. And in that decision, he completely transformed presidential politics in the United States from being untargeted to being targeted. You may have heard the concept of the swing state. The swing state is not the state that will never vote for you. It's also not the state that is definitely going to vote for you. California, New York, Massachusetts, they were always going to vote for Obama. And what Obama said, more than Clinton, Obama said, I'm not going to California except to raise money. And I'll spend that money in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Colorado, and these are the places where we will win or lose the election. We are targeting the battleground states. And so he put his resources where they would do the most good. Now that is the principle of targeting that has been used not only in elections and not only, as I will describe to you today, in policing, it's also been used in baseball. How big is baseball in Chile? Not big? Okay, sorry. How big is Brad Pitt? Do you like the actor Brad Pitt? Okay, he was in a movie about baseball. So if you don't care about baseball but you like Brad Pitt, watch this movie. The movie is called Moneyball. The movie subtitle could be How a Fat Kid from Yale, who studied economics and knows a lot of statistics, took a baseball team from being in the bottom of the league to the top of the league in 1 year. And he did it with what is now called sabermetrics, because SABR stands for the Society of American Baseball Research, kind of like the Chilean Society of Public Policy Research. So sabermetrics is now this discipline. It's 10 years old. It's evidence-based baseball. It was about using the scarce money that the Oakland baseball team had to find not the best baseball players in the country, but the most cost-effective baseball players based on one key indicator. And that indicator was whether they could hit the ball and get on first base. Because if they could do that, that was a predictor of the team winning games. The more people you have with that skill, the more games you win. And then this fat kid from Yale, not a baseball player, but a numbers cruncher, so he says to Brad Pitt, you can get people who can get on first base for a whole lot cheaper than the New York Yankees gets them. The Yankees buy the people who already have the reputation, and they pay a fortune. I can look across the league, I can get these baseball players from the minor leagues for almost nothing. And so Brad Pitt went out with a limited amount of money, and he hires all of these very good, cost-effective baseball players. He targeted his resources on cost-effective baseball players who met the test of getting on base before they were hired. So that's two T's, targeting and testing. But then once they were hired, if they didn't hit the ball to get on base, by tracking their performance, he would take them off. And he'd put up other baseball players to see if they would produce better once you start tracking their work. So these three T's of targeting, testing, and tracking are now recognized by Denise Rousseau, who is the director of the Center for Evidence-Based Management at Carnegie Mellon University, who I am told she's not only the editor of the Oxford Handbook on Evidence-Based Management, in which she tries to apply some of these principles of evidence-based policy and evidence-based practice into the business world to see how much even profit and loss is actually based on practices supported by evidence. But the question ultimately is how general the triple T of targeting, testing, and tracking may be. So before I start to tell you about crime and policing, let me just ask you to think generally, whether you're in areas like education or energy or transportation, traffic jams. I know there aren't any traffic jams in Santiago. So what I'm asking you is to think about your own area of research and how what I'm saying about the police might apply to what you're doing. How many of you here are in public health or health-related policy? Well, not many. So that's actually good for me because a lot of this is new. If you don't know about public health, you may not have heard some of these ideas. But I think public health is actually the model for all of public policy, because for a long time, they have been fighting the battle of evidence. They have been fighting against the dominance of theory. And before I get into crime, let me tell you about cholera, because the famous, almost iconic story in public health is about Dr. John Snow, who, in a cholera epidemic in London, did a map. It looks like a crime map. It was the map of where people were dying from cholera. And it was a very strange map, because all around this one well, people who came to use the well were dying. And across the street, nobody was dying. Now, the theory of cholera that was promoted by Florence Nightingale and all of the health establishment of England at the time, the theory was that disease was transmitted by smell. If you could smell it, you're going to die. And their solution to that, among other things, was to get all of the waste out of people's houses and put it in the river so you couldn't smell it. Where did the drinking water come from? The river. So you see some of the problems with theory-based practice. Anyway, what Dr. Snow noticed was that the smell should have gone across the street, but it didn't. What was across the street from where all these other people were dying? It was a prison. Why weren't the prisoners dying if they could smell the miasma, it was called? And the answer is the prison had its own well. And the well was not contaminated with cholera. But the well, what was contaminated with cholera, was right next to a house where a German sailor had died of cholera, and the waste had gotten into the soil. So he actually had to use all his persuasive powers to close down that well, because nobody believed his evidence. He showed them the map. They said, that's all very well in data, but what about in theory? Well, that's always a problem, even today. How does it work out in theory? It doesn't. It falsified the theory. But he got them to close the well, and the cholera epidemic stopped. At that point, he went head-to-head with the health establishment, and for 10 years, they refused to believe his results, and he died of a heart attack, and eventually, he succeeded in having a whole independent system for wastewater and drinking water established in London, which was built by another public health hero named Bazalgette, but that's another story. The point of the story is that having the facts, having the right evidence, is a good way to make yourself unpopular. People will hate you because they love their theory and they hate your facts. So if you want to be loved, leave the room right now. But if you're willing to stand up and die for the truth, like Dr. Snow, then here we go. Okay, so what this argument is about begins with morality. In medicine, in public health, we already accept the idea that you don't start a new treatment without testing the medicine first. Ever since thalidomide, with babies being born without limbs, the idea was you have to test a drug before it goes on the market. And nobody disagrees with that when it comes to drugs. But when it comes to public policies, including crime policy, they believe in blind decision-making. Blind justice is unbiased. That's good. I actually think justice should have its eyes open, certainly when it comes to the facts. Because the conventional wisdom about justice, about education, about transportation, public policies are simple decisions. They have clear consequences. They don't have any side effects. And it's obvious to experienced government leaders or experienced baseball managers. Watch the Brad Pitt movie, and you'll see all the old hands in baseball who are so skeptical of statistics and data and analytics. And they say, I've been in baseball 25 years, and I don't need to have these algorithms, these statistical numbers. The challenge whenever you have intuitive decision-making from experience and emotion running up against cognitive decision-making, Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I commend highly to you, it's like Nudge, but it's on steroids, and much more powerful scientifically about why people prefer to think in a way that doesn't require much effort. And what I'm talking about today is very difficult. It requires lots of effort, and that's why it's heavily resisted. But what I think the moral argument can be most persuasive is that if you don't test your policies, you will kill people. And I'm going to start out with an example of how a policy was developed, actually with some evidence, and it turned out to kill people. And it's not published yet, and maybe because I tell you today, the journals won't accept it, because I will have given advance notice. But if the journal editors are watching this on the web, please forgive me. I think this is an important group to make the truth known to you. So let me tell you about how a policy that was designed to protect victims of crime wound up killing them. And the victims of crime in particular were in a low enough seriousness category, not the kind of crime that normally people go to prison for, so we could put it into a randomized controlled trial. And in 1981, we did the first randomized clinical trial of arrest as compared to warning offenders. And that, with a randomized trial, a large sample, controlling other outcomes, it was a way we could follow up the consequences, initially for 6 months. And in the first experiment in Minneapolis, and it's in a lot of the statistics textbooks, in fact, that's all they have. They stop right there at 6 months. It showed that arresting people who were abusing their wives, slapping, hitting, kicking, not stabbing, not shooting, minor violence, if you arrest them, their rate of repeat offending drops in half for 6 months. So we published this in the American Sociological Review, and we said, this is the first experiment, it needs to be repeated, and it needs to have a longer follow-up period. And one of the repetitions, there were 5 more experiments, one of them was in Milwaukee, where there was almost perfect compliance, 99% compliance, with the police following the statistical instruction by random assignment to control for all other factors. And there the follow-up was somewhat longer. It didn't show a benefit. It actually showed that for unemployed people, it doubled their domestic violence, the suspects. For employed suspects, it cut it in half. So it was very conditioned on employment. But it was too short to tell about how it changes the life of the victim, if at all. And so, just so you're clear, these were minor crimes called misdemeanors in the common law, and they are the lowest seriousness of assault, but they're actually the most widespread form of assault. So it's a serious problem because of its huge volume. The collective harm is very, very serious. And I think it's an important problem, which is why I've been working on it for so long, which gives me the opportunity to ask a long-term follow-up question. And a few years ago, after the best experiment, the Milwaukee experiment, we looked at the victims' lives 23 years later. And what we discovered was this, that if the victim's abuser had been arrested by random assignment, she was 64% more likely to be dead than if the abuser was given a warning. And that effect was actually specified by the interaction with race, because for the black victims, the effect of having the abuser arrested was 100% increase. Well, 46%, you might say, from 50 to 98 deaths per 1,000 over the 23-year period, depending on what treatment was randomly assigned in the two columns on your left-hand side. For the white victims, in your two columns on the right-hand side, it's in the same direction. The effect is not statistically significant, but if it held up in a larger sample, it would be. The point is that the effect is much larger for the black victims, and it is, I think, fair to say, as many statisticians have told me, that this is causally related to the policy to arrest the abusers. Now, that policy is now in state law of the majority of the US states. 28 states require that the police do something that, in a controlled experiment, accelerates the death of African American victims. This is not the first time we have seen this. And to tie it back to Chile, where you have native populations who've been here much longer than European populations. Same thing in Australia. When we tested restorative justice conferences in Australia, in which the victims would meet with the offenders, and the police would lead the discussion for 2 or 3 hours about the harm the offender had done to the victim and how the offender might try to make up the harm to the victim. This was an effective way for white offenders to be treated by the police rather than prosecuting them, because it reduced the repeat offending. For violent offenses, the repeat offending dropped by 30% in the experimental group, and it went up by 20% in the control group. But for the Aboriginal offenders, it was the opposite effect. The effect for the Aboriginals was to increase their offending rate 400% if they had been randomly assigned to a face-to-face meeting with their victim. So one point I'm making here is that public policies can have different effects on different kinds of people. And that runs against the egalitarian premise of the law. One law for all, equal under the law. These are very powerful moral principles, but they collide with the idea of equality of results. To have equality of treatment with inequality of result is a moral dilemma. My book on policing domestic violence actually has the word dilemma in the title. And I think public policy has to face these dilemmas, at least empirically, and not to allow the politics of glossing over the problem to hide the fact that there are such different effects for poor people and rich people, for blacks and whites, for natives and Europeans, and wherever the differences may lie. Even in medicine, we know that some drugs have different effects on different ethnic groups. And in medicine, increasingly, there is customized policymaking that corresponds to the evidence from testing in clinically controlled trials. The second point, of course, is 23 years. How many of you have ever seen a 23-year evaluation of any public policy? Well, some things, like urban renewal, perhaps. But the standard for controlled experiments in the United States, suggested by the National Academy of Sciences, was a 2-year follow-up. These differences in mortality weren't evident until 20 years after the arrest was randomly assigned. So, just to be clear that you understand how this was done, either the police would handcuff the offender and take him away in front of the neighbors. He could be in jail for a few hours or for 3 days. And the case was almost never prosecuted. The prosecutor didn't want to prosecute. But if it was going to be a warning, the police would simply read a text not to have any more trouble, everybody should calm down, and then the police would leave with the offender right there. Now, they did this by telephoning research staff at a university. It's a good example of a partnership between a university and a government agency. At that time, the university opened sealed envelopes. Now we use a computerized program with a statistical algorithm to get equal portions of cases as you go along. This real surprise for the advocates of arresting wife beaters in the United States is going to be that almost none of the victims were murdered. And they think murder is the number one crime that you're preventing. But what we found is that murder is not the issue. The issue is heart attacks. The issue is stress-related disease, internal diseases of many kinds, kidney failure, and so on. And that leads to the question of how stressful it is for a victim to see their offender arrested, and how much shame on the family the arrest can bring. This was never a thought, never part of the theory, which was very punitive, very much around deterrence, and how the way to stop domestic violence is for the state to condemn domestic violence in the form of hundreds of thousands of arrests a year, which is what happened. But without understanding the long-term effects on the victim of the shame of their partner being arrested, I think we underestimate the impact. The idea of shame is particularly compelling with the biggest effect in this study, which is among women who are working. The employed women had a much higher rate of death. I hope the fact that 3 women have just left the room doesn't mean they're offended by my facts, but I indicated that if you want to be loved, well, maybe I should leave, because I always find it hard if people are so annoyed they won't even listen. But it's not perhaps that reason that they leave, but it is important to note that black women in Milwaukee in this study lived in neighborhoods where very few people worked. So to work is an indicator of a stubborn pride not to take welfare payments, not to be living off of others, but to be self-supporting. And for those hard-working, self-supporting women who were cleaning ladies, who were working at McDonald's, that these people were dying at a much higher rate when they had their partner arrested than where the partner had a warning. So I think it all goes to the emotional consequence of a public policy, which an economist might say is all about utilities, but which a psychologist might say, of course, it's fundamentally about emotions. And for the long-term strength of the immune system, there's a medical pathway here that we need to uncover, which we might be able to if we can follow up this population in which there's still 1,000 victims alive in Milwaukee. So the idea comes from combat veterans who have untreated post-traumatic stress symptoms, and they might have elevated rates of heart attacks and other mortality, not with very severe post-traumatic stress, but with moderate post-traumatic stress. But this is post hoc. It's trying to develop a theory after the fact. And that's okay if you are an inductive scientist. And I think public policy should be open to serendipity, to opportunities, and to be tough on them, to say, well, no, this is just a fluke. This is not what happens elsewhere. We currently have a replication going on in Miami, in which we're looking at exactly the same experiment, but with Hispanic people, mostly from Latin America, who have moved to Mexico, moved from Mexico or from Puerto Rico to Miami. And this Miami test may be the only one we can replicate it with, but you can start today. And any country can conduct this experiment and follow it up for 23, 25 years and see what the effect is on different kinds of people. Let me give you some good news, and it happened very fast. The good news is from a country where the police commissioner has studied evidence-based policy, has tried to transform 6,400 police officers into evidence-based policing in a very short period of time. And in a paper that I have now translated into Spanish, and I'd be happy to send to you, about the Triple T and the rise of evidence-based policing, this is a use of not such blind justice, of trying to look at what the data show. The data start out with targeting. The targeting of violent crime in Tokyo with this map is something the Japanese police could do. I understand they're still not doing it, but their own research and crime analysis team has produced this map. In 2005, they demonstrated that most of the violence in Tokyo is concentrated in this small number of hotspot peaks spread out across a very low-risk landscape, mostly, and you may find this in Santiago as well, mostly where the underground or the railroad stations come together, mostly where there's lots of people coming and going. There's more opportunities for crime, and there's more opportunities for police to deter the crime. The police being present at these locations may make the peaks shrink. The question in theory is, do the crimes go elsewhere? But there's lots of other evidence that suggests they don't, and that the best thing to do is to test a strategy across large areas of having the hotspots get extra policing at every hotspot. So targeting the hotspots, testing the idea of having much more police presence. If there's 5 or 10 times the rate of violent crime at those volcanoes, you have 5 or 10 times as many police. And then if that's what the test shows is effective, you have to track how many minutes of police presence there is at every one of those hotspots. So how do we do that? Well, let's start with the targeting. Here is a map of the most murderous part of Trinidad in Port of Spain. It's brand new. We drew these hotspot maps on Sunday. It's going to be used by a group of 100 police officers who are patrolling this area, trying to get them to spend more of their time right where the murders are occurring and not to be patrolling in the other areas, which, as you can see, are the majority of that area. It's having no murders. But the patrol strategy had been to go everywhere, to be omnipresent. And what we're suggesting is to target the patrol time as much as possible in those 18 murder hotspots. We already suggested that in 20 other districts where we can show you the hotspots. Look, these are very, very small areas where a police car could just drive back and forth and easily send the deterrent message. If you shoot somebody, the police are right here, they can catch you. What we haven't done, until Trinidad actually did it first, I think, was to give the managers the information about how much time was patrol delivered in the hotspots. And using the GPS signals from all of the police cars in 20 police stations in Trinidad, we were able to do something that the technology salespeople hadn't thought of, which is not just to show you where the car is at this moment, but to do the arithmetic of adding up all of the minutes that the police cars were at any given location in the district. And if we go back to this, those lines are now mapped out by the radio system as a geofence. Every time a police car comes into the hotspot, it registers on the radio record. Every time they leave, it registers. So the two registries of entry and departure come in from this information or from the radio that a foot patrol officer is wearing. And this is what is produced. you're seeing on the left-hand side 4 different police teams. They work the same area, they work the same hours. Some teams are doing a lot more patrol than other teams. This raises a management question, because you're tracking how much work people are doing with the same amount of time, the same amount of police cars. Why are the differences so great? You're also tracking something else, because on the right-hand side, those 4 bars are daytime patrols. On the left-hand side, those 4 bars are nighttime patrols. We're getting more patrol in the daytime. When do the homicides happen? At night. So, it raises many questions that can be discussed, but this is the most important. This was the amount of time that was spent in the hotspots. And in some of these cases, they didn't spend any time at all. If you then look at the ratio, this tiny bar on the right-hand side of the tall bars is the amount of time in the hotspots. In other words, they spent almost all of the patrol time away from the places where the murders were most likely to occur. And what we are now trying to do, from the commissioner's office right down to the constables, every week, is to drive up the amount of time in the hotspots to drive down the murder rate, which I want to tell you about in 2 ways. First, I want to say that while the police were looking at these kinds of maps, and this is 1 police car going on 1 patrol, and they were reprimanded by the sergeant because they didn't go to the hotspots. They discussed it at a meeting like this. Now, in the STAD program, the CompStat in Chile, it's the commissioned officers talking about crime. In New York City, where CompStat started, it's the senior officers talking about crime and what the police are doing by the hundreds, the police who are not in the room. What we did in Trinidad was to put the police who were doing the patrols in the room. And the discussion is not about what they should be doing, but why they're not doing it. Because these people are being confronted with the bar graphs as the evidence of what they did. It's like the department chair saying to the professor, "You only published 1 article last year. Why didn't you publish 3? This other professor, he published 5. You know what effect that has on professors? Police are human. And the police respond to that kind of discussion. So this was the result. At the bottom, you see the sum of 20 stations where these discussions, doing this in 20 stations, produced that line at the bottom, more than 30% reduction in murders and shootings in 20 stations where they did this, chosen at random, and another 20 that didn't do it, that were paired, had almost a 35% increase in murders and shootings. This was statistically significant in terms of, as you see, the baseline number was identical in the 2 groups, 71 murders and shootings in each of the 2 groups, a drop in the experimentals to 56, an increase to 95 in the controls. Technically, you could treat this as quasi-experiments, and these are the forest plots that this is actually after only. It's statistically significant, but even less likely to be due to chance is the before-after difference in difference data. It didn't work in every station, as you can see, but it worked in 10 out of the 20. 4 out of the 20, it actually got worse. But the overall effect, on average, as the meta-analysis tells us, was positive. And so it answers the question, at least for the moment, with homicide at a rate 4 times higher than it is in Chile, Trinidad and Tobago is trying to roll this out and to see if by having every hotspot in Trinidad given much more police time with tracking by GPS, whether we can push down the homicide rate. Not with a big CompStat at headquarters, with New York City and 40,000 police, but with these little ones. So just to move quickly to some other illustrations of using targeting, testing, or tracking, to be clear, the way I'm talking about targeting is for the greatest impact. And for testing, primarily with controlled experiments, perhaps quasi-experiments, but not with observational data, which is too biased, too prone to specification error to rely on. Evidence-based policy is a popular word in England right now, and for politicians it means somebody told them a story. For some police professionals, it's somebody did an observational study or a correlation. I think we need to push the standard up to where it is in public health. Evidence-based public health is based on controlled trials. Tracking is observational. Tracking just needs to audit the links. And in fact, in the United Kingdom now, they're so concerned about crime reporting data, the government has just funded an annual audit of all crime data in all of the police forces, all 43 in England. So for countries that are obsessed with controlling their costs, cutting their budget, as England is, evidence-based policy is very popular. Targeting on the power few is very popular, whether it's places, offenders, or victims. Let me just talk about two kinds of offenders. One is killers. In the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society in 2009, we published an algorithm that was nonlinear, based on random forest models, and it predicts with much greater accuracy than previously possible who is going to commit the next murder, or who is going to commit the next serious crime, such as a rape or an armed robbery where somebody almost gets killed. We were focused on a probation population of 50,000, which is just exactly what Chile has out of prison but under criminal sanctions. And this high-risk difference for any offense was 8 times more likely to be charged in the next 2 years in the high-risk group, but for murder it was 75 times more likely. Now, I think most people, even school teachers, would like to know which of their students is 75 times more likely to fail if they don't get extra support than other students. This kind of differentiation based on risk is potentially widespread, but so far very limited. If we go from committing crime to recruiting new offenders, this is where we started, with the fact that in Sacramento, California, one of our master's degree students at Cambridge discovered that 1/3 of all of the robbers had been initiated by these senior recruiter robbers, or what the student liked to call typhoid Marys, people who spread around the infection of crime. And this is what his analysis looks like for several different offenses, with the center circle being the node of the network and the size of the circle being bigger if there are more connections. All the little circles around the bigger one are the connection. So here's what it's like for auto theft. There are very few recruiters. 27 people are doing the recruiting over the last 8 years into auto theft. If you want to target auto theft, you can go after those 27 recruiters and have all 146 auto thieves that are known to the police probably reduce their rate of offending. With burglary, much larger numbers, but 4 to 1. It's 2,000 recruits, but only 482 recruiters. And they are running a controlled trial focused on those recruiters right now, seeing that throughout their network, if they're targeted by police, the crimes of the entire network are dropping in response to that targeting. Similarly, in robbery, there's 377 recruiters, 1,700 known recruits. Targeting the recruiters is a way to reduce robbery. Same with narcotics. And this whole approach of not only identifying these social networks is well known in police. But police in England haven't tested an intervention. What they want to use it for is to solve crimes after they've happened. But Sacramento just jumped right from targeting to testing to see if the crimes could be prevented. And they know, at least our graduates know, that a trend is not a test. That ultimately governments may rise or fall on whether crime goes down, as Trinidad may well do in 15 months. But unless you add in the control group to know what would happen otherwise, you don't know what effect it had. This is actually from the restorative justice experiment on violence in the national capital of Australia. It had almost no Aboriginal offenders, with this white European population not prosecuting the people arrested for violence by random assignment sent to restorative justice. That was the bottom line. If they were by random assignment sent to be prosecuted in court, that was the top line. Targeting inmates leaving prison, you can do the same thing with something that was discovered by accident in the hurricane in 2005, Hurricane Katrina. You may recall that God conducted a randomized experiment in New Orleans. The hurricane destroyed some neighborhoods, not others. Random assignment of destruction. Now, if you're coming out of prison in 2005, you either go home to where you're from in New Orleans, or you can't because your home is underwater. So the prison department in Louisiana sent half of the offenders coming out of prison someplace else in Louisiana, not where they lived. They went to Baton Rouge, they went further north. They couldn't go back to their old neighborhood. They had no money. And whether they went back to their neighborhood or not was independent of their criminal record, independent of any risk factors. And what was the effect on whether or not they came back into prison within the first year? That was published in 2009 in the American Sociological Review. And then 4 years later, the follow-up was done. And what David Kirk found was that those who relocated, skeptical as this police chief was after 1 year, but after 4 years she gave up. She said, okay, I'm persuaded. It was relocation that had that effect. That if they went home, their rate of failure was much faster, that 65% had failed, only 35% were still out of prison in the 12th quarter, the end of the fourth year following release. That's the bottom line. Everybody above that line had gone back to prison. But for those who were sent someplace else, the top line, they were surviving. 2/3 of them still had not gone back to prison. A huge effect. Let me put it in Chilean terms. If you took your offenders from Concepcion when they're coming out of prison and you send them to Santiago with a little bit of money and help to get started, and you take the offenders from Santiago when they come out of prison and send them to Concepcion, this is what effect you would get if this would apply. That's a big if, but it's a test. And if you do your own test with random assignment, as they may do in the state of Maryland, you might find that relocation is, whoops. You might find that relocation is the most effective policy for reducing repeat offending. And in theoretical terms, people can start a new life when they go to a new community. Whether their own community is good for them is something you might target. You might say, this person's got a good family, none of the family members are in prison, they live in a low-crime neighborhood. This person has a terrible family. The father's been in jail, the mother's been in jail. Why should they go back to their family? They should go to a new neighborhood where they can get a new start. So there's a policy waiting to be developed out of this finding, just as there is out of the finding from a systematic review of prosecuting juveniles, which finds that across randomized trials, whenever juveniles are kept away from court and the police just say, don't do it again, for most minor offenses, not shooting people, not raping people, but the vast majority of juvenile offenses just go away, and maybe they don't even get arrested, but the evidence in randomized trials suggests that's a good policy. And where the solution to juvenile crime is to prosecute more of them, the evidence suggests you'll simply increase their recidivism, their repeat offending rates in the future. Final observation, it's not a controlled trial, it's propensity score matching. This is the effect in Amsterdam of putting people in prison for the first time. And when you do, you raise their recidivism rates so high that you completely wipe out the incapacitation effect, the crimes they couldn't commit while they were in prison. It's higher for property crime than for violent, but there seems to be something so bad about going to prison that you really accelerate the process of committing crime. The first time they go, it suggests policies that could try to do everything possible to make offenders wear electronic monitoring, to make offenders do reparative work for the community, public chain gangs if you want, but not prison, because prison seems to be so bad. And we know many people who are raped in prison. They suffer post-traumatic stress coming out of prison. It makes sense that prison can be one of the most criminogenic, crime-causing public policies you can have. I'm going to stop right here and just leave you with this injunction to test, test, and test. Thank you very much.
So, thank you. Tenemos algunos minutos para preguntas. Hay dos personas con micrófonos. Por favor, a quienes desean hacer preguntas, nos lo indican. Vamos a permitir 3 preguntas. Luego de eso, Lawrence responderá. Si hay más tiempo, seguimos con 3 preguntas, etc. Por favor, comiencen a preguntar una vez que tengan el micrófono para que la traducción pueda ser la adecuada. Doy la palabra a quien desea hacer la pregunta concreta. Bueno, no tan concreta, no sé.
Sobre... Aló.
Okay.
Aló. Sí. Sobre la aplicación del principio de targeting, testing and tracking a otros ámbitos. Me pareció muy interesante su observación de que intervenciones similares producen resultados dispares. El tema del targeting en la política social ha sido bastante discutido, entonces me gustaría que profundizara un poco más eso, que es socialmente divisivo, etc. Entonces, ¿cómo un país, un Estado puede decir, yo voy a focalizar con alguna evidencia, porque la evidencia nunca es perfecta, voy a focalizar en este segmento y a este segmento voy a hacer esta intervención versus esta otro, voy a hacer esta otra intervención?
Okay, thank you.
Un poco me gustaría que aclarara un poco más esto de experimentos. Me dio la impresión que lo que ustedes estaban utilizando como técnica son cuasi experimentos, por lo tanto no están evaluando grupos controles para distintos tratamientos, o sea, no están analizando un tratamiento con grupo control y por lo tanto no pueden ver efectivamente los efectos, sino que están viendo diferencias de medias en términos de tratamientos distintos. Y lo que sabemos un poco cuando analizamos esas técnicas, cuando utilizamos estos métodos cuasi experimentales, es que realmente no tenemos una clara medición del impacto que tiene un tratamiento respecto de otro. Entonces me gustaría que aclarara un poco eso.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Profesor Sherman, Yo quería preguntarle sobre el uso de evidencia. Usted habló del COMSTAT, que es en algún sentido el STAT chileno que está comenzando, pero me gustaría que vinculara o nos diera a conocer la manera en que eso tiene impacto en los salarios, incentivos, en el sistema de retiros o de pensiones, el tipo de beneficios monetarios y no monetarios en que se involucran las policías una vez que utiliza uno este sistema donde uno trata de premiar el rendimiento, y si eso a su vez genera algunas consecuencias no deseadas o si en algunos lugares está siendo bien utilizado y está teniendo, entonces se están alineando los incentivos de la comunidad de reducir los delitos, pero por otro lado eso también está teniendo impacto positivo en los policías.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. The first point about the politics of targeting is very, very important development. It's interesting that when there's an earthquake that hurts one city more than another, nobody objects to having all of the relief go to the city where the earthquake hit. It was interesting, however, when Osama bin Laden attacked New York City and Washington, that when we appropriated huge amounts of money for counterterrorism in the United States Senate, 2 votes from each state, they insisted that the counterterrorism money not be based on where the terrorism risk was highest, but based on the population of the state. So out in the middle of the country with cows and sheep and not many Al-Qaeda, they got just as much money to prevent terrorist attacks on the sheep as they did to prevent airplanes hitting skyscrapers in New York City. This was a famous test case because after 10 years, they finally gave in and they finally accepted the principle that counterterrorism money should be allocated geographically where the risk of terrorism was highest. And so I think we have to try to develop dialogue, not as a general principle, because that's not how politicians or most people think, but I think case by case, if we can make the point, if we can personalize it with the faces of people who are suffering, and saying, you know, why should there be just as much police patrol with this pretty little girl's neighborhood that hasn't had a burglary in 3 years as there is in this little girl's neighborhood with a sad face because her house has just been burglarized for the 3rd time this year. I mean, I think ultimately there is an empirical science of persuading people that targeting makes sense. Independent from the science of whether targeting does make sense. There's 2 different tasks. But with a lot of evidence, how you persuade people to accept the evidence is a completely separate question. And maybe we need more evidence about how to communicate evidence more effectively with the use of stories to illustrate what the evidence actually shows, as opposed to using stories for evidence. But again, evolutionary, cognitive structures. For millions of years, we humans sat around fires and we told stories. We didn't sit around looking at bar graphs. So I think we have to go with what human instinct feels is good, and that's telling stories. Ultimately, that's what it's going to take, something in that path. Secondly, as to the experimental methods, I want to be absolutely clear. The domestic violence experiment was a simple random assignment experiment with 1,200 cases. Every case was registered by the research office before the random assignment envelope was open. The police officer was on the phone. We told the police officer, in this case, you give a warning. And they followed exactly what the statistician at the University of Minnesota set out by a random numbers sequence as the treatment each case should get in sequence, and they came in totally blind to what the treatment might be. It was just as much random assignment as any medical experiment is. With the Trinidad and Tobago experiment is different. When you experiment with places, you don't have as many cases. So there is the idea of what's called block randomized design, And in the first experiment in Minneapolis, we actually divided 110 hotspots into, I think, 4 different blocks based on the amount of crime they had to try to avoid imbalance with a relatively small sample in terms of how much crime they had. And that's the other thing. Places differ a lot more than people in terms of how much crime. We had places in Minneapolis with 1,000 crimes. I've yet to find an offender who has 1,000 crimes in his criminal record. So when you're dealing with places, it leads you to block randomized designs with increased statistical power by matching either in pairs or in larger groups, in assembling the group and then randomly assigning within the group. And that's exactly what we did. So technically, it was not 20 quasi-experiments. I just analyzed it that way so you could see how actually for some experiments you got a different result. But when you have randomly assigned the treatment, as Richard Burke wrote in the Journal of Experimental Criminology in 2005, meta-analysis makes sense. It doesn't violate assumptions when the treatments are randomly assigned. When they are true quasi-experiments in which you pick one site and then you pick a control, and that's not random assignment, then you probably shouldn't be using statistical significance tests or even average effect size. And that's what Burke concluded. But what I showed you was actually random assignment in block randomized design with 20 blocks. And I can refer you to the to the Handbook of Quantitative Criminology for a lot of statistical detail to elaborate that. 2010, edited by David Weisberg and Alex Piquero, published by Springer. Finally, I'm happy to say that CompStat does not give monetary rewards to police anywhere in the world that I know of. There might be CompStats for people working overtime, and there might be other things that would look like finances, but I think they're really being driven by a very professional motive, which is to try to get crime down. The risk is not that the police who are doing the patrol will somehow distort the situation. The risk is that the people doing the crime registration will register the crime as less serious. So in Philadelphia, we found a shooting case. Somebody got shot. The police officer called the ambulance. The shooting victim went into the ambulance. The police officer wrote up the report. The crime registrar read it and said, oh, this was assist an ambulance case. So it goes down as a service activity and not as a report of an attempted homicide. So if the registrar is cheating, then you have a problem. New York City has actually put 5 people in prison who are high-level police commanders because they were telling their registrars to cheat. And there was even an iPhone audio recording of some instructions to do this, which makes it harder to cheat. And now that Britain's spending even more money to audit the registrar's work and to compare all of the data around one crime. I mean, I was doing this, 1972, the New York City Police Department was calling back victims. And the victim said, in the report, it said the victim was at dinner at a restaurant and they turned and their purse was disappeared. So that's a larceny. We called up the victim. The victim said, I was walking down the street, this guy punches me and grabs my purse and he knocks me down on the ground. That's a robbery. And so we know how to do these things, but it's when you put it in a framework of tracking and checking through audits on every step of the measurement, because measurement is money. In the U.S. Post Office, they had a system of measuring on-time delivery of the mail, and the system was that they would have a test mailing in each jurisdiction. So the test mailing wasn't well done. They would have a big bundle of letters. And in the West Virginia Post Office, somebody spotted it, and they went right to the manager. The manager took the letters, hired a private messenger service, and he immediately delivered the letters to all of the addresses that they went to. So he was way up high at the fastest mail delivery in the United States. And somebody said, doesn't smell right. He went to prison. You have to be tough when performance measurement matters.
Bueno, estamos en el tiempo, así que hasta acá vamos a dejar la presentación de Lawrence. Le damos las gracias en nombre de la sociedad y a todos esperamos lo que sigue. Muchas gracias. Oh, present for you.
It's very kind.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like it's chocolate.
Chocolate is very good.
I hope it doesn't.